Okay, we're going to go ahead and get started. We want to first of all welcome everyone uh, for showing up and being a part of this conversation. Um, for those of you attending, this is the Future of Education webinar, and we were quite excited and surprised by the large number of people who expressed interest in participating in this conversation today. This is the beginning of a dialogue. By no means is the end to it. And the purpose of this conversation is to give us greater insights into how different constituents within the education systems see how the future of education is enrolling. And we want it to be even more than what we call the future of education. We want it to be about the learning of learning. These are conversations that have begun long before our current situation of COVID has changed our very reality of how we interact with the university and schooling and learning. And it's part of a larger conversation that's going on, both in community levels, at state levels, at federal levels, and even international levels. So this is one of many types of conversations that are going on. And the important aspect to this particular conversation is that we want our voices here in San Diego to be heard as part of some of these larger conversations. We want the perspectives, and we want the perspectives across all major constituencies, from the undergraduate and graduate students to the academics and staff at universities, but also from community members and lifelong learners who avail themselves of the resources we have at a university. Today, we are very pleased to have a number of great panelists that would be part of this conversation. What I would ask you to do is, if you have a question during the conversation, please put it into the Q&A section of this. We will be monitoring that throughout this conversation, and if it's a question that's relevant to the topic we're talking about, we will try to put it in. Given the nature of time and time constraints, we may or may not be able to get to all the questions today, and if we don't, we just want to apologize up front for that. Our particular lead guest today, Zhen Go, and I have been friends and colleagues for a number of years, and this conversation about the future of education began as part of a larger project that she and her company have been working on through the United Nations Development Program. When she told me about this project that they were working on, I thought it was a wonderful opportunity to bring that project to UCSD, for them to, again, like I said, hear the voices of what we were doing here, and to start a dialogue about how we can help advance this national narrative, and for what we're going to do about the future of education. Our panelists today are comprised of experts in the field of not only of data capture, but also represent the undergraduate students, the graduate students, as well as the administration and leadership of UCSD. My name is Greg Horvath. I am with the Office of Innovation and Commercialization at UCSD. And as such, we take this very holistic approach, not only to the university, but about the university's role in society. We try to advance the nature of innovation in the aspects of no content and programs that we do, but also how we can help society innovate, and how the university itself can innovate for its students. I first want to introduce Zhen, who's going to give us a brief overview of the project that she's been working on. As I said, Zhen and I worked together for many years, but rather than me introducing her and telling you all about her, I will let her do that. So at this point, Zhen, I will turn it over to you.
Thanks, Greg. Good evening, everybody. It's really nice to be here. I hope you're all keeping safe, keeping healthy. As Greg mentioned, these are unprecedented times. It's been an interesting journey for me, because I'm currently back in Singapore, where I'm from, and I've been living in Chicago, so it's been interesting to experience it on both ends of the globe. Just a little bit about me, I guess. I work for an organization called Cognitive Edge. We basically specialize in the science of uncertainty. So it's been a really interesting time for us. We work in the area of complex adaptive systems, of which education is definitely one. I read this brilliant article just last week, and I was so inspired by this one quote. I thought I would open today's session with it. It was an article published by Thomas Friedman in the New York Times, and he had this line that said, when you press, essentially he said, what's going on in the world is it's almost as though we've had a pause button pressed on all of us. And he said the funny thing is, on a computer or any type of, simple mechanical system, if you press pause, it stops functioning. But in a human system and with people, the minute you press pause, that's actually when they start functioning. They start thinking, they start reimagining what things could be like. And I kind of wanted to open with that, because I think that when we're here thinking about the future of education, that's essentially what we're trying to do. It's inviting you into this conversation to rethink what that might look like. Drawing from some conversations, again, that we had last week together as we're planning for this, we talked about the fact that if we think about the evolution of the education system, it actually isn't even industrial in nature. It's actually agrarian. So we think about the education calendar and the way we actually function, the way we time classes, all the way from K-12 education to university to postgraduate, is actually based on the agrarian calendar. The fact that in the summertime, you needed the time off to till the fields. And this is really, I think, a legacy system. And we've been trying, I think, at the edges to nudge it along, to actually help it to progress for some time. And as Winston Churchill said, let's not waste a good crisis. This, I think, is a really good opportunity. There are new things that we are all doing, new ways of working, new ways of doing classes. We've never had a disruption on a scale like this. And again, since this is being conducted by the Office of Innovation, I think that in any crisis, you also want to deploy your innovation teams. And I see the body of students as the most innovative thinkers out there, because you are not yet constrained by the systems that we're actually so deeply embedded in. So a little bit about the program that we've started. This is actually a larger, what we refer to, for lack of imagination, maybe as an education program. So we've done this in many countries now. And there is a brilliant publication that came out just last year by the UNDP country office in Moldova that I can make available to everybody if you're interested after the call. They actually did this across 3 universities. They actually engaged with people at the level of policy, at the level of government leadership. They wanted people to actually engage from industry, because at the end of the day, the role of the university is so central to any country or state's sort of development. You're building this pool of knowledge, of talent that is supposed to go out into the market after that and support it and innovate and potentially become entrepreneurs. And I've worked in education before joining Cognitive Edge, and it was very interesting for me, and I'm sure a lot of the graduate students and the undergraduate students are going to agree, is the best ideas always come from the students. Again, because they're not yet what we call entrained. They don't have these deeply entrained perspectives, so they can actually afford to think outside the box. So our approach is based on a concept of what we call distributed ethnography. So it's the belief that every single one of us has that power and that ability to actually become ethnographers of our environment. In recent years, I think there has been a surge of interest in using ethnography and anthropology for business and to actually develop industry. We're trying to bring that into a more systematic function. And that's why what you will have after this call, I assume, is we will be sending out a link to invite all of you to essentially become the ethnographers of your own environment, of this system of education that you're embedded within, taking into account that there is UCSD that you sit within. UCSD sits within a broader economic region. Instead of thinking about it as education, how would you like to participate in society as we move forward? One of the most commonly, cited things about education is we're not just giving people this route training, we're actually building the leaders of the future. So what should that look like for you? And often what we find is that comes from a balance of observing your environment, trying to observe, take note. These are the things that I'm noticing. This is what I'm seeing. And collectively, imagine if we have thousands of people sharing those perspectives. One of the challenges, just to give a bit of background, I'm actually an anthropologist by training. So I spent many, many years doing field work. I was an ethnographer. One of the challenges that I had is that if you spend too much time doing ethnography, you end up with a large amount of qualitative data that it's very difficult to make sense of. So what we are doing with our tool is allowing you to all share qualitative data. It's like a focus group at scale. But instead of just having large amounts of unstructured data, we're also empowering all of you to actually index your own data. So you code your data, you tell us what that means to you. We're returning that power of interpretation back to all of you so that when we're looking through the qualitative data, I am not lending my own lens to it alone. I'm actually taking a collective perspective. The data, when it comes to us, is actually going to empower and enable the system to actually make decisions that take your voice and your perspective into account. And there is a systematic way, and that's why when you look at the tool, you'll receive an infographic that highlights some of the general trends that are going to nudge the future of education. And then you're going to see some geometric shapes. Essentially what we're actually having with you indexing your thoughts and your perspectives on those geometric shapes is actually the ability to collect thousands of perspectives into pattern forms. And that allows us to easily visualize the field of education as it is seen by the students. We started Capture last year, just to be honest. We've gotten fairly good response from the staff. And I know I was in conversations with the Office of Innovation, whom we're partnering with, and I said, this is really great, but we're really missing a critical component of this. We need to hear the voices of the students because that's essentially, at the end of the day, who we're designing a system for. I'm hoping, and that's a bit of my ambition, that as we actually work together and as we actually move this forward, as Greg mentioned, this is just the start of a conversation. It's not going to end here. We're going to want to actually invite industry to actually take part. What do you see? What are some of the jobs you think you're going to have to fill? What are some of the talents that we need to actually close the gap on so we can continue to make the region competitive? What are some of the areas that essentially then fit back into this broader ecosystem that we're all a part of so that it supports the overall development of this? So that's a little bit about the overview of the broader program. Greg?
Thank you, Zhen. That was a fantastic overview. And as we kind of engage in this conversation, we'll be able to kind of come back to the work that Zhen does and how it fits in. At this point, what I'd love to do is introduce our panelists and then jump into the conversations. And the first panelist I'd like to introduce is our Executive Vice Chancellor, Elizabeth Simmons, who will talk about her role at the university and kind of the current climate and response to this topic of the future of education. Elizabeth, I'd like to turn this over to you at this point.
Okay, the test nowadays is, do you remember to unmute yourself before you start speaking? So, okay, managed to do that. I'm really delighted to be able to be here today, and I'm particularly glad that Adarsh and Rachel are here with me, as well as Zhen. I think it's great to have this collaborative conversation. My role as Executive Vice Chancellor for Academic Affairs means that I'm the Chief Academic Officer of UC San Diego. I'm in charge of everything to do with teaching and learning, faculty and students, academic space, and so on across the university, which it means I get to work with a lot of fantastic people at all their different stages in their careers and as learners. And that makes it very dynamic. So the university, you know, our long-term goals for the university have already included a couple of things that are very relevant today. One, right now, we've been working on becoming more student-centered and more focused on the quality of education. We're already a superb research university, but as the Chancellor likes to say, to be truly an outstanding university as a whole, the quality of the education and the attention we pay to it needs to match. And so our long-term goals, along with that, then have included educational innovation. That's something that we've been working on for the last several years and are going to be heightening that, partly to promote access to more far-flung and diverse and including lifelong learners, to help the citizens of California and well beyond California learn at their pace on topics that they really need to know about, and that maybe they discover they need to know about at different times in their lives. To help the faculty be supported to be very creative in the ways that they teach and that they learn about effective teaching. To make better use of the facilities and resources that we have on campus to do the most possible with them, to connect with our current students in new ways, and to connect with future students in new ways, and then to maintain that connection with the alumni. Because in the long term, the university should not just be a place that you come for 2 or 4 or 6 or 8 years to get 1 or 2 degrees, and then you go away and you never think about it again. It should be a place that you have a lifelong connection to, a place that you keep returning to as you move through different stages of your career and your life. Perhaps have children or other young people enter your life and maybe you connect them to the university that you are part of. It should be a place that you find intellectual and cultural community with people of similar interests to you, but also of varied interests so that you learn from them. And it should be a place that you learn from peers as well as experts. So for all of these reasons, really educational innovation and thinking about the future of education is extremely important to everything we do here at UC San Diego. We've just had a new Associate Vice Chancellor for Educational Innovation join my team. That's a brand new position, because it is that important to us to be able to really support our students and support learning in the ways that we need to going forward. This has been an interesting few weeks, and I'm sure we'll get to talk about what these last, well, we're in week 5 of totally remote due to COVID-19, and I'm sure that Adarsh and Rachel and I will all get to talk about that a little bit more later on in the conversation. Back to you, Greg.
Thank you so much. And at this point, I'd like Adarsh to introduce himself and to talk a little bit about his role, both as a student, but also as the with the student union. Adarsh?
All right. Hi, everyone. Thank you, Greg, for that introduction. So my name is Adarsh. I'm the Associate Vice President for Academic Affairs as part of Associated Students, which is UCSD student government, the undergraduate student government. And as part of that role, I sit on a number of academic Senate committees. I've been part of a number of Senate work groups, which have tended to define certain aspects of the student experience on campus. And I've also been part of a number of search committees, which have helped identify some of the chief officers on this campus who help to direct the scholastic direction of the school. I'm a double major in political science and history. So, you know, not knowing what to do with those degrees, I'm planning on going to law school in the fall. But being part of Associated Students has certainly been one of the capstone experiences of being on campus, because I think it's really important that not only do administrators have a voice and faculty have a voice in these conversations, but that also students can bring their perspective in and ensure that the student-centered mission of UC San Diego is really met. So I'm going to kick that back to you, Greg. Thank you.
Thank you. And we're also honored to have Rachel joining us. And so Rachel, do you want to say a few words about yourself?
Sure. So my name is Rachel. I'm serving as president of the Graduate Student Association. That's the counterpart, I guess, to Associated Students. So we represent 8,263 grad and professional students. I'm working on a PhD in mechanical engineering. And so I've been in school for the past decade, and things have really changed a lot since I was a freshman in college. I'm an engineer by training, and so innovation definitely runs in my blood. And I'm just really passionate about, improving life for students, namely grad and professional students. We were actually just looking at our old Bill of Rights that our organization had written in 2011. And that Bill of Rights is totally academic and education driven, and it's great. But I think in the past 10 years since I started school, there's been this huge shift towards inclusivity and social mobility. And so EBC Simmons was talking about access and interconnectedness. And I think one thing that just really resonates for me is, inclusivity. It goes hand in hand with community. And so it's exciting to be part of this and to share some of my thoughts and experiences. And also, as president, I get to hear tons of other thoughts and experiences. So hopefully I can bring some of that.
Fantastic. Really appreciate that. Now, before we go into the questions, I want to point you out to your side panel, which includes the chats and Q&As. We've embedded a link in there to the SenseMaker questionnaire. One of the goals of this particular webinar is we would like your voices. As part of anthropology, we need this data. And so if you would please take a few minutes at some point in the future to participate in this questionnaire, that would be very, very helpful to us. And that way we would include your voices as well. Thank you. So I'd like to actually start with the kind of, I won't call it the elephant in the room, but the big question in the room, which is around this COVID reality that we're living in. That, as Zhen was saying early on, this is a bit of a pause button for us, but as human beings, we don't stop functioning. We actually kick into a different gear. Kind of what are those gears that you guys have kicked into? So I'd love to hear from both Adarsh and Rachel first about how has this change really affected and changed not only your life and lifestyles, but how it's affected the way you are now going to class, learning yourself, and give us some of your perspectives. Either one of you can go first.
I was watching the mute button on Adarsh's pane, but I'll start. This has actually been really interesting for me because I am ready to advance to candidacy, but I don't know if you've ever written any of these crazy proposal documents or a thesis or anything like that. My advisor requires us to write 100 pages before we can even do a proposal or, kind of think about doing a thesis. So I wrote that document in my time in quarantine. I'm pretty excited about that, but that productivity is very different for everyone. I think for me, I'm super lucky. It was the right time and I really needed the pause to kind of take a break from all of the crazy things that I do. It might be surprising to know that a president of a student government is hyper involved, but that is what it is. And it's been helpful for me. I know for other graduate students, people in wet labs, people who access archives in the library to do their research, things have just ground to a halt. And so they're struggling with being up against the clock and sort of what their timeline to graduation looks like, what the scope of their project even is the funding going to be the same? There's a lot of ambiguity and a lot of challenges with the COVID-19 situation for those folks.
Adarsh, representing the undergraduate opinion, what would you say has been different, not only for you, but some of the students that you work with?
I think that the main kind of fear, at least I'm graduating this year in the spring, and many of my colleagues are graduating as well. And the big fear is if they're not going on to graduate school, what else is there in this economy right now? Hiring freezes are just sweeping the world. And it's really terrifying, I think, to think about. It's already tough to get a job anyway. And now going into this kind of economy that's limping along, how are people going to move into that transition from university to full adult life, which is hard as it is. But as far as classes, I've heard a lot of mixed things. Some people like the fact that Zoom exists and that they can go to lectures online, and definitely the asynchronous aspect of that, if they can listen to the lectures at a different time than class normally scheduled. Many students find that as a helpful review tool or just a planning tool, given that there's all kinds of things going on at home. But on the other side, it's really hard to stay on task. When quarantine started in, I don't know, the end of March or so, I was finishing up my undergrad thesis, and it was great because I could work 14-hour days just sitting in front of the computer typing the thing out. But for a lot of people, it's the small rituals of walking to class that help them stay focused from class to class. So I think that that's been a big transition.
Elizabeth, I'd love to hear kind of your perspective after you've heard these. And of course, you're coming at it from a very different perspective, and COVID has affected not only your job, but the job of education considerably. We'll take her off mute. I can see.
I knew it was going to happen at some point, you know. You spend 10, 12 hours a day on Zoom and it's going to happen. So I would say I still remain incredibly impressed by how quickly the students and the faculty and the staff all transitioned. We had basically 2 weeks notice that we were going to be fully remote. And that 2 weeks included a time period of nearly half of that time the faculty were giving and the students were taking final exams for winter quarter. So the 2 weeks, you know, is a little bit of an exaggeration, but in a 2 week period, boom, we went remote. The students, many of the students had to move home in that time, and they had to then set themselves up to do whatever remote learning was going to be. The faculty had to figure out how they were going to do the remote learning while being locked up in their houses pretty much. And I've just been really impressed by how well everybody has adjusted, and by the important role also that student government, both AS and GSA, have played in making sure that when students were encountering glitches in different kinds of classes, they felt that they could talk to student government, and student government could bring it to my office, and then we could make sure that the information got out to the faculty who maybe needed to maybe communicate something in a different way, or check if the technology was working, or help their students understand what was going on. And just having that kind of channel of communication was really helpful. And that's something I think that really got reinforced for all of us in this remote environment, is the importance of having multiple communication channels, and how important are close collaborations with the different areas of leadership. So administration with student leadership, with Senate leadership, and so on. I think the transition we've gone through is a harbinger of the future. We can teach and learn in ways we had not previously dreamed of. There are actually tasks that technology is pretty good at. As Adarsh was just saying, for example, you can go back and re-listen to that part of the class that maybe you realized wasn't as clear as you thought the first time through. And you actually can get a replay and learn something extra from that. As a faculty member, you can go back and see, did I say that how I meant to? Or would I say it differently next time? Or should I retouch on that the next time class meets? You get a chance to go examine, which is pretty cool. We also just get that chance to rethink how people actually learn, what parts of the courses are most valuable, and how we find community. All of these things, I think, are going to impact us a lot going forward.
Question for Rachel and Adarsh, in that Adarsh mentioned that very much the education experience is a series of kind of these habits, rituals, and practices, like just the idea of walking to class that you get. Now, of course, your rituals and practices have changed dramatically. Are there any ones that you're adopting now that you kind of like, and you will probably, after COVID, you may kind of put them in as part of your routine? Opening up to either Rachel or Adarsh. I see they're afraid to go off.
That's a good question. I haven't really thought about that. I mean, the one thing I can say hands down, which is great, is being able to wake up later than normal. Getting those additional hours of sleep has certainly helped my happiness levels. But I think one of this perhaps is not a habit that it's not a habit that I'm going to keep, but it's certainly one that I'm going to ensure that I stick to when I return to school, is creating a division between the space in which I do work and the space in which I do everything else. A big thing for me, and the reason why I would be on campus a lot during the year, is because I didn't want to, when I got home, I didn't want to do an ounce of work. I wanted to finish everything on campus so that when I was at home, I would have a space to do everything else that I wanted to do. And that disruption has been kind of difficult, because at home, there are necessarily going to be all kinds of distractions. So hopefully when we're able to go back when we're able to go back to campus in person, I think that's something that I've definitely realized I've valued a lot more than I thought.
Rachel?
You know, I just got engaged and I have 2 dogs and a cat, and I am busy most of the time as can be. And sometimes my fiance is like, man, like, I want to hang out with you, but you're doing so much. And it's like, I love all that I do, but I've been able to take time to really slow down. I get to cook a lot. I love cooking. Like if I could have my dream job, I'd love to just be an executive chef and go from there, but not that talented, right? I just really love that. So I've gotten to explore a lot of things that I haven't made time for in the past. And I think one thing I'd like to keep taking forward is setting aside the time for me and for myself to do things that I love. I mean, I made myself a mini mock-up home gym, so I get to work out at home, I get to cook all the time, and I get to spend a lot more time reading or even just drawing. Little things like that really have been keeping me happy and keeping me grounded. So I want to take more of that self-care into my everyday life after this quarantine is over.
Okay, so do you guys feel that this has given you a bit more control over your life, or has it taken away control?
I think it depends. It's something that's certainly given more control over the way that at least I spend my time. But it's also a loss of control because I chose to come to a campus. I could have done online school. There were already schools that existed that did that. But I chose to come to a residential campus because that was what I saw for myself in my future. So it's equal parts a loss, but also a gain. Definitely the self-care aspect, as Rachel was saying, is really paramount.
And obviously one of the key roles of any university is not just merely for the transfer of knowledge for the purposes of learning and education, but also empowerment. And do aspects of this digital lifestyle somehow empower you in new ways that they didn't before?
I don't know if you get to play around as the head of a Zoom meeting very much, but I chair my student government meetings, and it's definitely really interesting how much responsibility you take on when you're leading a meeting of like 50 people, and you need to make sure that every voice is heard equally. So that's a pretty interesting thing. Also for grad students, we are able to do our defenses and our examinations via Zoom right now, and that's really, really different. I mean, in my department, it's very common for you to invite the department to come to your defenses. And that means that anybody can come, and any faculty person, so it could be like the hardest professor you've ever had, can show up. And I remember I was giving an hour-long presentation, and this faculty person showed up and asked some really hard-hitting questions. No longer do you really have to stress about that extra who's going to show up to my defense thing. So it's kind of regained some of that confidence as a student. The converse though is that sometimes those questions are really thought-provoking, so you kind of also lose some of that inspiration that can come.
So we've had a number of participants ask a few questions, so I'll throw them out to you, and you guys can decide who might be best. This first one might be best for Elizabeth to answer, but everyone can weigh in, which is there a possibility for education to transition into remote virtual learning for good? Maybe perhaps not in the near future, but in the distant future. In other words, do you see that as a primary delivery mechanism, or will it always be complementary to kind of an in-person experience?
I would say that at a university like UC San Diego that has really been trying to build up the full residential experience and a lot of experiential learning through internships, lab and studio classes, engagement in service learning, and so on. I think that remote or online learning will be a bigger part of what we do going forward than it has been in the past, but I think it will be complementary to the best of in-person experience. We learn a lot when we have to come live among strangers. I've done it as an undergraduate, as a graduate student in a couple different places. And it forces you to realign your thinking in certain ways that you only get really by having to be with all those folks a lot of the time. So I think it'll be complementary, but won't completely take over for us.
Jen, do you have any input on that? Just from what you've seen going around the world doing this study.
It's been really interesting because prior to COVID and all this massive migration to online, I mean, that's one of the scenarios that's described in the timeline of a future education tool that we're distributing, that, these MOOCs, right? These online courses are starting to become more popular. It was revolutionary when I think, Harvard started to stream their classes online. But one of the things that, I certainly believe this. I think one of the most important parts of education is not merely the course sitting. That is just a small part of it. It's things like Rachel and Adarsh are engaged in student leadership. It's learning to actually engage and be with people from multiple different backgrounds and cultures. It's just the socialization process of actually having to stand up there and defend your dissertation, or to actually respond to a difficult question. When I was in graduate school, I found it. I personally like to believe that, at least for me, it was more of a test of tenacity than anything. And that's what it taught me. It's that the lesson of tenacity, to constantly go for something, even when it's difficult. And I think that I so much echo what Elizabeth has said, which is it has to be a balance of both, because we don't want to miss out on that aspect of education.
The other thing that we're seeing too is that, because we've been kind of looking at what online education can do, and going back even to when Saul Khan was flipping the classroom through the Khan Academy, that we find that certain knowledge, particularly explicit knowledge, works very, very well over these kinds of mediums where I can push information and knowledge to you. But so much of the college experience is also in building your human operating systems and building your social networks, and having all the tacit experiences of what it's like to work in groups and disagree and come to consensus, and build together. That very often a lot of these online platforms aren't yet at the place where they can represent accurately those same kind of things. That said, as people are working on those, and we're working on a number of projects to see what parts of those human experiences that we get so much value out of can be done in virtual space, and which ones have to be done by us literally just colliding. Because very often the serendipitous interactions that we have just as students walking to class provide some of the greatest value we get out of an educational experience. Great. So one of the students asked, and he said, it's not really a question, but just wanted to get our opinion. As part of the college experience, I believe education is definitely important, but a big part of this experience should be about communication and society. So the question embedded in that is, well, studying online is good, but how is this experience different from other online courses? Right now, I don't know UCSD education is any different than any other online education system, such as Khan Academy or Chegg or Tutor, any of those. So how would you say that kind of how we're approaching online education might differentiate itself from what you could just get almost commoditized online in other sources? So Elizabeth, I don't know if you want to jump in on that one first.
I could jump in a little bit. One thing is that the people who are doing the teaching of our remote courses are still the same faculty who normally teach our courses when they're in person. And these are the same scholars who give their lives to teaching and to research and creative activity, and are these deep experts in their fields. And that's something particular to the research university, that connection between the education and the research side. Another is that, of course, we still have all of the wraparound support services, the teaching and learning commons, academic advising, counseling and psychological services, success coaches, all of these different supports available through remote media that we would have in person. And that's something that you're not going to have in the same way at a place that isn't normally a full service university with all these aspects. But I'm going to stop there and ask, I think it would be good to hear from our student leaders here, what they see.
Excellent. Rachel, why don't you jump in?
Sure. So actually interesting, my mom did her whole degree through University of Phoenix, which is a for-profit university, very different model. And, you know, that's all online based. And the amount of community she had totally was different from this. The amount of experiential learning that you get at an online university in that format is very different. I mean, you're taking these classes just to get the job knowledge that you need, but the social mobility and the inclusivity and those things aren't as big of a deal. I had another thought and I think it might have escaped me. Oh, I got it, sorry. Also, there's this idea of accreditation. So as an engineering student, there's a certain level of accreditation the university has achieved, which means that my degree has a special amount of value. And so people in the world who know UCSD and who know the engineering accreditation, they're going to say, oh, okay, like you've completed this coursework under the supervision of these experts and these administrators who we know make a program that makes you qualified for this job. So the accreditation is also super important.
Adarsh, do you have anything to add?
Yeah, I mean, I'd just like to echo the EVC's point is that the quality of professors is what has not changed. And that's been a huge boon when it comes to the online learning experience, because the same professors that deliver quality in-class instruction have shown their adaptability and their intelligence when they're able to seamlessly switch to an out-of-classroom format. You hear a lot of people all the time, you know, what got you interested into so-and-so subject? And they'll say, I had this professor my freshman year and they were really passionate. That is something that cannot be understated. And I don't think, there are plenty of wonderful online services out there, but one of the big reasons why the professors are here at UC San Diego is because they are the people who inspire others to pursue their discipline. And that's not lost just because things are on Zoom.
There's a question here that we have that kind of follows on that I really like. It says, we hear a lot about how learning is changing, but does anyone have insight into how teaching is changing? For example, Rachel and Adarsh, would you say your professors have changed their teaching styles and or expectations around those? What resources and incentives do professors have, especially given that some have honed their teaching styles for years in the classroom setting? And maybe Elizabeth can take that one. But I'd love to hear from both Adarsh and Rachel first, and then have Elizabeth weigh in.
My biggest qualm as an engineering student is that, and I have an undergrad degree in physics, and a lot of that degree work is sitting in a quiet room deriving things, and it's kind of painful. And then you get these exams, and I've always thought like there's got to be a better way to teach this or to learn this. And in some ways, it's totally worth sitting in the quiet room and just figuring out how you get from point A to point B. But I know for example, I keep coming back to my advisor. He's awesome. I get to interact with him a lot, and he's older, pretty stubborn. And I was absolutely stunned at how he totally pivoted his teaching style to be remote, and, you know, just having the ability to fit the mold and to really break out of his box and be able to teach, you know, this biological materials class, which he usually teaches with just a whiteboard, is really, really remarkable, I think. So I think we're moving from something where it's just sit in the dark room where, you know, folks have to talk to the professor, they have to engage with the material in new and different ways, because you can't, it doesn't make sense for a professor to sit in the hour lecture and derive on their iPad when they have so many other things that they want to, you know, cover in that time.
Elizabeth, I'd love to hear your perspective. Mute.
Yep. I was getting there. So I really, I'm really heartened to hear what Rachel has said. That certainly goes along with, you know, what I've been hearing from the faculty as some of them talk about their experiences. That yeah, I can do it in this new way, and maybe in a way the short time to make the change sort of helped because we got past the worrying about how we were going to do it and just did it. But I've heard some faculty say, you know, some students talk now more in class now that it's through Zoom or through the chat, because sometimes that's more comfortable in a way because maybe they're more used to interacting in an online environment, or there's something more democratic about the, you know, just put your hand up and then the computer's telling the professor who asked the question in what order, and you don't just keep looking, say, to the right side of the room and always calling on those people, or all these things we all fall into. But I've also heard some faculty say, you know, I didn't think I'd like this, but actually, you know, I'm going to be around in the summer because we can't travel so much. I think I'm going to sign up to teach a summer course because it's remote and now I know how to do this and I'd kind of like to try it again. And so I think that's been really positive, that they're seeing it as a way to try something different, interact with the students differently. Some have had very small group meetings with all the students in their classes to try to get to know them a little, because you can't hang out at the lecture bench in the front and just chat with people before and after, but you could do that other sort of thing.
So a follow-on question to that, Elizabeth, would be, you know, in your role as EVC, how do you balance kind of the nature and need to try new experimentation, new ways of teaching and delivering, but also playing it a bit safe and kind of managing the expectations of the faculty and the staff and everyone? And kind of how do you navigate that?
Yeah, you know, part of that is by remembering that the faculty by and large have had a lot of experience in teaching, and to trust them with that we say, look, we'll help you with the getting the things online. But we know that you know how to either to give a lecture or construct an assignment or hold a discussion. And then they can find their comfort level with, well, how is this working for the students? Is the discussion working? Do I need to do a little bit of, you know, change it up a bit? If I tried to tell the faculty, you should teach your course exactly this way, like as if I knew how everyone in every subject should, that wouldn't work at all. But trusting them because they want to do this well, right? And some of them started, I think, okay, I'm going to just put my exact course online. And then they started branching out a little. Okay, I'm going to try something a bit different. The other thing that we did is that we let them know that you know, they're going to get feedback in the usual way through CAPES and graduate student evaluations, but that we're also going to use more holistic teaching evaluation methods, as we were planning to do anyway. But we're really encouraging the departments to use a variety of ways to give feedback so that the faculty can learn as much as possible from the experience. So they're knowing that they have some freedom to take some chances and they'll get feedback and learn about how they did, I think has been encouraging.
So following on that, and this is one of the questions that someone asked, they said, responding to the pandemic is the first time UCSD has really had online classes, although they've had spots of them here and there. Why do you think that there were really not a large number of online classes before? And do you foresee these reasons coming back up once the pandemic, once we've gotten to the other side? Do you think a large percentage of people will go back to the way, or do you think that some of these things will continue to go forward?
So we have been working, actually, ever since I got here 2.5 years ago. I've certainly been spending a lot of time talking to people about that very question. Why don't we do as much online teaching? A lot of our peers do. And part of it was the history, the culture of this particular university, what people felt comfortable with. And if the university, if people haven't been very interested in trying it, then the barrier to trying it sort of creeps higher and higher because, well, if we've never done it, then maybe you'd have to do it in some fantastic way for it to be even worth it. I think people's just having to all get the experience of even just a little bit of what remote or online feels like is now freeing people to think about, oh, maybe I could, and I've heard people saying, well, you know, maybe I could flip my class going forward, podcast the lectures, and use the class time to really interact with the students. I think we will see more of this experimentation going forward. There are individual faculty who are already building or interested in building online courses. And I think they'll feel more comfortable, more welcomed to do it. Of course, they'll still have to go through the same process of getting Senate approval for a course to be a fully online course. But I think people will now know more about, well, what's involved? How do I do that? And they'll have some data to show about, well, I taught it remotely, and here's how much the students learned. And so it'll be easier for them to present a case to the Senate that what they're doing has value. It won't just be an abstraction.
Jen, what, you know, as you have all these other perspectives from other places, do they kind of mirror what we're kind of seeing here in San Diego, or are you seeing some other insights?
You know, it's interesting. You know, I think it's not just about teaching online. I think one of Telstra, which is the largest, you know, they provide phone service across Australia. They just announced, I think a couple of days ago, that their entire customer service arm is going to work from home permanently. You know, I think this is going to have impact on how we work in general. And framing that back into education is how are we going to actually create that type of balance between teaching is, and I want to pick up on one of the points that Elizabeth made earlier about feedback. I think that what we're starting to see is moving away from the summative type of feedback that we've gotten used to when systems were stable, when education was just following a regular semester by semester, you know, at the end of the semester, you have this review. What we're seeing is that we're actually going into real-time, ongoing feedback that is more formative for the overall development of teaching methods, teaching styles, and there is this instantaneousness to it, right? It's sometimes funny because although you might assume that in an online setting that you're essentially broadcasting to people, and sometimes you don't even see their faces, that maybe that feedback is not that great. But actually it's funny, and I'm sure that, you know, Rachel, as you were defending some of your presentations to people, you will notice that when you don't get feedback, it's actually more traumatizing. It forces you to self-reflect a bit more. It's, oh, I didn't hear anything about that. I couldn't see their facial expressions. Did I do that quite right? What are some ways I could have shifted the way I do things? You know, because we're so used to communicating for response. When you don't get a response, I think is again when we really force that self-reflection.
Wonderful. So one of the things we are realizing is that we now have choices before, more choices than ever before, but how do we avoid being overwhelmed by all those choices? And so one of the questions that was pushed to us is there are more options than ever for education and online learning, which includes boot camps, MOOCs, one-on-one tutoring. And how do students as well as the administration navigate all of these options? And how can a university position its relationship with students over the lifespan of those? Elizabeth, do you want to answer that from that, and then I'll ask the students, how do you navigate all these choices that you have? Because sometimes that can be more overwhelming than just the work you have in front of you when we constantly ask you to make choices.
It can be, and that's why it's really important to have a whole ecosystem of advisors and success coaches and so on who can help you learn how you want to think through all the choices and make a decision tree for yourself. How are you going to order your priorities to choose which directions you want to go in? And that's why it's important to have not just a course catalog sitting there, but some knowledgeable people, whether they are faculty or academic advisors or whoever, to help you learn how to think through that.
And so far, Rachel and Adarsh, how have you kind of navigated all the choices, or have the choices been made for you, or do you still see that you have, particularly when you have whatever free time you have, how do you make choices about what you decide to consume and digest?
I guess I'm gonna go at this at the perspective of what I was kind of thinking of when I was deciding to apply to law school. The major considerations for me were location, the program, the requirements, the cost, and the timeline. And I don't think that those considerations are unique to just education, or whether you're choosing between an online degree or an in-person degree. They're everything. I mean, they go with jobs, they go with extracurricular opportunities. And at the end of the day, I guess, you know, the way that I would decide to take something on is this sufficient to get me to where I want to go? And then the second question is, if it's sufficient, do I want to go further? And that's kind of, I feel like, the argument in this day and age to go for a residential education is because any education that gets you a degree has the potential to get you a job, but a residential education has the potential to get you so much more. And that extra cost, that marginal cost, you have to decide whether the utility gained from that cost is going to be something that you see as valuable for your future and your career.
Rachel, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, so I've been at this for a long time now, and I think one part of it is the amount of community and the type of mentorship you're receiving. And mentorship doesn't have to be, oh, I do research in this professor's lab and this is my formal mentor. It can also be, I met somebody who's a second year, or my RA. Actually, I'm really good friends with my RA from my freshman year of undergrad, and that person was a really helpful guide in kind of navigating the resources on campus. So mentorship and community played a big role early in my career, and then as I became more mature, I figured out what my learning style was, and now I feel like, you know, if I know that I need to learn something, a skill, a specific skill for something, then I know I want to go towards a boot camp. But if I know that I'm really struggling with a certain type of math or a more conceptual thing, then I might go for a one-on-one tutor. I'm actually also on the side, my side hustle is a one-on-one tutoring thing. And I find a lot of time that students who engage in one-on-one tutoring are actually also looking for a little bit of guidance towards, you know, what is my purpose? Why am I learning this? And what is coming next?
Very, very good. The one thing that these platforms and what we're experiencing now has highlighted is the importance of the democratization. Part of the reason these tools exist is so we can give access to the content and these people that are able to deliver it. But is access, from your perspective, both Adarsh and Rachel, do you hear from the people you represent that access is equal, or some places still having trouble accessing the knowledge and these courses, and is it equal, or do we still have more work to do there?
I think, well, okay, so there are a number of people who benefit that I've heard at least, who benefit from this kind of online format, and chief among them are commuter students who sometimes have to spend 3 hours, you know, coming to campus and going back. This is time they could spend eating, sleeping, studying, whatever they want. This was basically sunk time to them before. And I've heard from a lot of them that this has been really, really great for their lifestyle. But there are additional difficulties, specifically among people who don't have good internet access, who have trouble with doing so much as turning on their video for Zoom. They miss out on that kind of social network-based education, I'd say. And then there are people in our disabled community who don't have the capability to interface with computer resources like many of us do. And as we look to make education more accessible, these are the things that weigh chiefly on my mind, at least, to make sure that when we have this technology available to us, it's not just moving it online so we can lower costs and stuff like that. It's also making sure that with the online resources, we're making sure to target people who were already disadvantaged in the first place, and now we have the power to give them an education like this one.
Rachel, any insight?
Yeah, so not even thinking about you know, remote learning and online learning and things like that, I see problems with inaccess that go all the way back to the roots of someone's education. Sometimes it's a confidence thing where people are told, well, you're just not that good at math, so don't worry about it. And they spend their whole lives with this narrative of I'm not good at math. But I mean, I got through calculus, so I think anybody can get through calculus with a good teacher. But seriously, I think at our university in the engineering department, we see people who come from high schools where they didn't have a strong math background, and so then they're inherently disadvantaged by just the content of the courses. And sometimes when you mix in remote learning, you kind of take away that opportunity for the student to come to the professor and say, hey, I'm having a hard time with the mechanics of doing this math, or, you know, the mechanics of this concept. Do you think you can give me some more resources? Can you point me in a direction? You know, how can I access more help? So yeah, I think, and then also adding to Adarsh, there's also students who struggle, who are parents or who are caretakers, who have a boisterous family home that they're staying at, where finding a quiet place to sit and study may not be a possibility at this time.
Here's a question for both Zhen and Elizabeth. So a lot of new experiments are going on. People are not only doing this virtual, but this is not, and this conversation shouldn't be only about virtual and online training. We're doing all these experiments. How are we measuring the effectiveness of this? So now that we're going online, what is UCSD putting in place to kind of understand how effective this is, but also pointing out where we need to improve it?
So as part of our regular reaccreditation process, we need to work on assessing how well we do at helping students attain the learning outcomes, learning objectives for courses. And so that is something that all of our departments are supposed to regularly be working collectively with the faculty around all of the courses to keep assessing that. That is something that our Teaching and Learning Commons, for example, helps each department work on not only having the learning objectives identified, but measuring whether the desired outcomes are being achieved. So that's something that we have to do whether we're in person or remote or in a blended environment. The Teaching and Learning Commons and Educational Technology Services in this particular quarter, where we've been entirely remote, have been working with faculty and departments to help them adapt what they already need to be doing to the online or remote environment. So that's just part of how we have to do our work normally. We're just having to do it in a somewhat different format. We will definitely be encouraging faculty to think about this, reflect on it, report on what they tried, what worked, what did they learn from it, from this quarter in remote format, to to bring their best scholarly attention to that question and think about it as they would think about any scholarly question.
Excellent. Zhen, of course, I teed this up for you since that's a lot about what Zhen does.
So it's interesting, and thanks for that question, Greg. Even before all of the digitization of everything, we had already been receiving a lot of requests from educational institutions, or just in general, any institution that is delivering something that is traditionally very hard to measure. One of the issues is if you look at a lot of traditional measures, they look at things like how much progress someone made on a linear scale. And so often human development, it's not linear. and a lot of the nuggets that you get from things tend to surface in anecdotal ways. So that's actually a lot of where SenseMaker has been applied. So one of the cases, and I can share this, is a project that we did with a university in the UK. And in the UK, students have to fill out this annual survey to essentially assess the level of value of the education that they're getting from the university. The problem, though, is that that assessment is also tied to the ranking of a university. So you're sort of in this catch-22 situation. You can't entirely be honest. You want to improve the quality of the education, but it also overall, and then has this double-edged sword effect of actually then affecting the quality of your education as well. So, you know, how do we actually start to shift away from these very linear, you know, somewhat lacking in texture and granularity, because so much of making improvement requires traction, and without texture, there isn't traction. So, you know, how do we actually surface some of those textured experiences? And that's where SenseMaker has been used to collect that anecdotal type of information. You know, it's really focusing on the experience, and those experiences can shift from the beginning of a course to the middle to the end of the course. And beyond that, you know, it could be that a lot of the things that you are taught in university don't start to make sense until, you know, 1 or 2 years later, especially if you're in your first and second year. Those are more foundational. So it's really tracking overall the student's journey. How are some of these things coalescing? How are some of these things becoming coherent? And that's another type of project that we have run with other universities, is to understand the student journey from first year to fourth year, and also from fourth year and moving into their first job. What are some of the challenges? So we can actually calibrate the whole system to support the student journey.
I like that. And, you know, of course, a big part of UCSD's role in the community is to produce the human capital that creates society, which includes the workforce. So as the nature of work is changing and the nature of the workforce is changing, how can these tools really be adapted to service more the state of what the workforce is becoming, as opposed to what historically it has been? Do you have any input on that, Jen or Elizabeth? And then I'll ask Rachel and Adarsh. See, what we know is that the world is becoming far more dynamic, that in real time it's changing. And one of the points that I've made in my lectures is that it's no longer just enough to create expertise. You also have to build in resilience, cognitive agility, and most importantly, behavioral fitness. The idea that the world changes at a moment's notice, and the most valued members of a society in terms of workforce development are these cognitive athletes, these people who act as much like the special forces as they do the infantry. So how is UCSD and other universities adapting or reimagining the educational process to take into account those skills?
I mean, I think in a very general sense, through encouraging students to participate in leadership training and in student government, to participate in some of the activities, say, of the Changemaker Institute, and think about the kind of social innovation and impact that they can work on during their times as students, to start putting some of their knowledge to use, participating in events like hackathons and grantathons, where you do have to show that agility in teams, designing courses that use some of those team problem solving approaches. I think that, and then of course, you know, things like all the various different internships and so on. I think those are some of the ways that we encourage students to think of themselves in those terms. But I'd love to hear how the students see it, really. I think that's particularly important.
I mean, in a PhD, they demand that you have depth and also breadth. So at this point, I got to figure it out by myself. But I'm kind of kidding. I have participated in one of our leadership programs at UCSD, and that was a really awesome way to challenge how I've learned what I've learned about engineering and physics and how I can apply that to a team situation, and how when I'm leading, how do I speak a language technically and get buy-in from my peers on my team, but also speaking the language accessibly so that when I'm talking about something that I'm an expert in, I can still, talk to anybody about that. I think that over time in my field, we've moved towards a lot of group projects and moved towards these breakout sessions and things. And I think one thing that I'm really proud of at UCSD is how many undergrads we get involved in research. I know a grad student who oversees over 20 undergrads, and personally absolutely just loves it. These undergrads are integral to his project, and the way that he coaches them and mentors them is really amazing. And so I think the community and the shared value of all of us wanting an experiential learning, like it's not enough to just be like, okay, I took this class and I was good at it. I feel like there's a sense of we're all in this together and let's figure out how to figure this thing out. And that creates this level of mental agility.
I definitely agree with that. And the opportunities that the university provides, especially for undergrads, as an R1 institution, the kind of access that I have as an undergrad to professors and to research events and symposia is pretty incredible. We have the Undergraduate Research Conference every spring where scores of people present they present their thesis projects, they present independent study projects. We have the Teaching and Learning Commons, who created the co-curricular record, which helps to demonstrate to employers and to graduate schools that the activities that undergrads are doing on this campus have been verified by administration to help develop leadership skills. And then I also want to highlight the UCSD extension. With the continuing learning program, we have the idea of lifelong learners. That's really critical, and the work that the extension does in our community, as well as kind of being, I guess, the exploratory space for things like online educational delivery, is really wonderful. And for about a year, I worked in the Extension's Institutional Research Division, and a lot of the work that was being done there is kind of at the forefront of what pedagogy is today and what instructional delivery is today as well.
So what are some of those, so I'm curious, what are some of the insights you've gotten off of kind of the pedagogy and kind of the future of how that's evolving?
So one of the big things that's discussed in the literature a lot is that we're heading into, actually, I don't know the exact count, there's like 4 or 5, but maybe it's the 5th industrial revolution or the 4th one or something like that. But basically the idea that we are stuck in a pretty industrial model of education, and moving to a more collaborative setting is 100% necessary to adapt to the modern workforce. The idea of only having one job when you get out of school is silly, whereas 30 years ago it would have been expected. And the idea that the hard skills, like being able to be an expert in a subject, while they're important, it's not what industry leaders say that we're lacking. The CEO of LinkedIn was at a conference about employability some number of years ago. And one of the most famous things that he said is that the things that employers are looking for, they're not really looking for skills in the traditional sense. They're looking for people who can talk to other people and who can write an email. And those are the skills that, are missed in a formal education, but I feel like institutions like ours are making great strides to ensure that the students that we send out into the world are really equipped to meet every single demand of a very organic and changing work ecosystem.
Wow. Rachel, do you have anything to add?
I would just like to say that in all my accomplishments here at UCSD, the best feedback I've actually gotten is usually based on my communication skills and how I get excited about my research. So I definitely strongly agree with what Adarsh has expressed. I do think this idea of an industrial education mechanism is totally true. And I think we're moving towards a place where people are really starting to understand that community and success and social mobility and education are very deeply intertwined. And I think, you know, in all my time, I've been a part of, you know, women in engineering groups and a lot of other access and success programming, and nothing I think helps people get, you know, kind of get out of their shell more than just finding someone who is similar to them and shares that core value with them. And so this idea of collaboration in education is super, super important as well.
Elizabeth, did you want anything?
No, I think they covered it beautifully.
Excellent. So Zhen, any insights from some of the projects you've done that would help us kind of understand where this is all going?
I mean, what I'm hearing from all the panelists on this call, and it's feedback that I've been getting from a lot of our other partners and clients as well, is, and this is a point that you've been making, Greg, is that, you know, how critical it is to actually start to partner radically differently than we've used to. You know, this concept of entanglement, which is a concept that I'm borrowing from design thinking, that to borrow this industrial metaphor that Adarsh mentioned, is, you know, with that industrial metaphor came this belief that there were levers and there were drivers and there were things, buttons you could push and levers you could pull. The real world is a lot more complicated than that. And what I've heard from Rachel is you know, if we're talking about communication or the ability to write an email, I had a conversation with a lady who said that she had been brought in by a school district in Washington to develop a template for teaching high school students how to take a phone call, because, you know, using the phone is no longer business as usual. So it's really these soft skills, that the things in between the hard stuff, that I think are going to become critical. And I think with recognizing entanglement and partnerships, it's really critical. So one of, I think, a really good example I can think of recently is Singapore was impacted by COVID maybe a month or two sooner than the US. And when I was back home in January last, I got a call from one of my partners in a local university, so the Singapore Management University, saying, hey, we have to do this ethnographic research project, but with social distancing, it's no longer possible. So he called me because he wanted to use SenseMaker to do some of the ethnographic portions. But what happened with that call is I then linked them up with the Ministry of Culture and Youth, which is one of our partners in the Singapore government. And then we got linked up with a charity organization. And through that, we actually formed a task force to understand how residents in low socioeconomic status communities in Singapore are responding to it. And the students were actually developing research that helped to inform the ministry's ability to respond to those groups of people, and the charity's ability to craft social outreach programs. And it's this interesting triangulation that happened completely serendipitously. And I think that it's the need for that openness to radically partner differently. That's sort of my main takeaway from that last sort of conversation.
Greg, could I add one really brief thing?
Absolutely.
Building off what all three have just said about communication and soft skills, I think one thing the university learned from COVID-19 is the need for the university as an organization to develop its communication skills and its soft skills to, for example, make services available where and when students actually need to be able to access them, not by say you must go to this particular office in this location at this time, but no, it should just be you can access it any time, and then maybe asynchronously an answer can get back to you or a phone call can be arranged. All sorts of things that we can do as an organization to communicate and engage better.
Wonderful. And so this time, Gwen, can you put up the next slide? Because as we said, one of the things that we wanted to do as part of this conversation is to encourage, enable, and enroll you into participating in these conversations and questions. And part of that is participating in this research project that Jen has talked about. And so if Gwen's going to put up the slide, it will have the information in there. Of course, we can push that out for you. And then also our commitment, because very often one of the reasons surveys, questionnaires, projects where we kind of do this ethnography are less than exciting for a lot of participants is because we never push the information back to you. So our commitment is for those people who participate and respond, we will share the information of what we learn with you. And it'll be this dynamic kind of circular conversation, that it won't be merely just about what we collect, but what we learn from the collection. And then when we gather actionable insights, we can share those with you and have you participate with us in how we now implement and measure what we do with those insights. Rachel, you mentioned that we have a link to share with them. So here, can you put that up on the slide so people can see it for that? Is that what you wanted to do? I apologize. I was getting some side messages on what we were doing. So we can send out to everybody this particular slide. This is what it's going to look like. It will explain a little bit about what we're trying to do. But one is, we said we want to make this an ongoing conversation. We would like your participation as we move forward. And is what we'd also are going to be doing more of these conversations to dig deeper into very specific areas of what we call the future of education and the learning of learning. And a lot of this information will be kicked back to us so we can do that. So we want to, first of all, thank all of our participants and panelists. So Elizabeth, Adarsh, Rachel, and Jen. Thank you very much for participating, and thanks for being a part of the conversation. But more importantly, thanks to all of you who took the time to join us tonight. We hope it was a worthy conversation. We're sorry we could not get to all the conversations and all the questions that were happening. There were some certainly very, very good ones, from social equity around education to the use of technology in new ways. And we will certainly we will take those into account as we kind of create new platforms for what we're doing. So at this point, I want to thank everyone and wish everyone a lot of health and prosperity, but also feel free to reach out to us anytime. Thank you. And good night.